The silk curtains flutter in the midnight breeze as a shadow moves through the Imperial Palace. No footsteps, no sound. Just death walking on silent feet through corridors where emperors sleep and ministers plot. This is not a warrior charging into battle with banners flying and drums beating. This is something far more terrifying. A Chinese assassin, armed with weapons so ingenious, so brutally efficient, that their victims often died without ever knowing they'd been attacked. You think modern assassins with their high-tech gadgets and precision rifles are the pinnacle of lethal efficiency? You think James Bond's Q branch invented the concept of disguised weapons? What if I told you that over 1,000 years ago, Chinese assassins were using weapons so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating, that they make today's spy technology look like children's toys? Today, we're not talking about honorable warriors meeting on the battlefield. We're diving into the shadowy world of Imperial Chinese assassination, where death came disguised as beauty, where the most innocent objects became instruments of terror, and where killing was elevated to an art form that combined engineering genius with psychological warfare. These are the 10 most brutal weapons that turned ordinary men and women into the most feared killers in ancient history. And by the end of this list, when you see the number 1 weapon, you'll never look at everyday objects the same way again. We begin our countdown with a weapon that redefined the concept of hidden death: the sleeve arrow. Picture this. You're a high-ranking official in the Ming Dynasty, and a humble servant approaches to offer you tea. He bows respectfully, his hands folded in his sleeves as tradition demands. In that moment of courtesy, you die. The sleeve arrow was a compact, spring-loaded crossbow mechanism strapped to the forearm and concealed within voluminous sleeves. With a subtle flex of the wrist or tug of a hidden cord, it could fire a steel dart with lethal force at ranges up to 15 feet. The mechanism was so refined that it made virtually no sound, just a whisper of death cutting through the air. But here's what made this weapon truly brutal. It weaponized social etiquette itself. In Chinese culture, keeping your hands hidden in your sleeves was a sign of respect and humility. The sleeve arrow turned this gesture of deference into a delivery system for murder. Victims died not just from the dart, but from the psychological violation of having their own cultural norms used against them. The White Lotus sect and other secret societies favored this weapon because it allowed them to eliminate targets in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, without anyone understanding what had happened until it was far too late. At number 9, we encounter a weapon that turned beauty into a harbinger of death: the plum blossom needle. Imagine receiving an exquisite gift from an admirer. A delicate ornament shaped like a plum blossom, the symbol of resilience and hope in Chinese culture. You reach out to touch its intricate petals, and in that moment, your fate is sealed. The plum blossom needle was a palm-sized container, often crafted to resemble jewelry or decorative objects. But hidden within its innocent exterior was a spring-loaded mechanism that could fire a volley of fine, needle-like projectiles. Some versions were thrown like grenades. Others were slapped against the victim's skin, depositing their deadly cargo on contact. Here's where the brutality becomes truly diabolical. Each needle was coated with potent toxins, extracts from the deadly monk's hood plant or the poisonous jaquirity bean. A single needle prick, barely noticeable among the dozens that struck, would deliver enough poison to kill within hours. The victim might brush off what felt like a minor scratch, only to collapse in agony as the toxins ravaged their nervous system. But the psychological warfare was just as devastating as the physical. The plum blossom, a symbol of beauty and renewal, became an instrument of terror. Victims learned to fear gifts, to suspect beauty, to see death lurking behind every gesture of kindness. Number 8 brings us to a weapon that embodied the deadly contradiction of Chinese assassination arts: the Iron Lotus. In Buddhist and Taoist philosophy, the lotus represents purity rising from muddy waters. In the hands of a Chinese assassin, it represented death disguised as innocence. The Iron Lotus was designed specifically for female assassins operating in the imperial court. Shaped like a closed lotus bud and small enough to conceal in the palm, it appeared to be nothing more than a decorative ornament or religious symbol. But with a sharp squeezing motion, razor-sharp metal petals would spring outward, transforming the innocent flower into a vicious punching dagger. The weapon's genius lay in its dual nature. In its closed state, it could pass any inspection. Guards would see only a woman carrying a religious token. But once activated, those metal petals could tear through flesh and arteries with devastating efficiency. A strike to the throat would sever the carotid artery. A punch to the abdomen would shred internal organs. Female assassins of the Red Lantern sect were particularly skilled with this weapon. They could approach their targets as servants, concubines, or religious pilgrims, their Iron Lotus hidden in plain sight. The victim's last sight would be a beautiful woman reaching out as if to offer a blessing, only to deliver death with the speed of a striking serpent. At number 7, we encounter a weapon that turned the very architecture of imperial palaces into a tool of assassination: the flying claw. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a complete infiltration system that allowed assassins to become living nightmares, striking from impossible angles and vanishing like smoke. The flying claw consisted of 3 or 4 razor-sharp, curved iron talons attached to a long rope or chain. When thrown with expert precision, these claws could dig into wood, stone, or flesh with equal efficiency. But here's what made it truly terrifying. It was a weapon that defied the laws of physics as ancient people understood them. Imagine you're a minister sleeping in your heavily guarded chamber on the 3rd floor of a palace. The walls are smooth stone, impossible to climb. Guards patrol every corridor. You should be safe. Then you hear a soft, metallic click against your window. Before you can react, a figure in black swings through your window like a demon from hell, the flying claw having carried them up the impossible wall in seconds. But the brutality didn't end with infiltration. In combat, the flying claw became a weapon of psychological terror. The curved talons could snag clothing, armor, or flesh, allowing the assassin to drag victims from horseback, pull them off battlements, or simply tear away chunks of muscle and skin. The sight of a comrade being dragged screaming across a courtyard by invisible chains was enough to break the morale of entire guard units. The weapon's reach meant that no one was ever truly safe. Even surrounded by bodyguards, a target could be snatched away in an instant, pulled into the darkness where the real work of assassination could begin. Number 6 reveals perhaps the most insidious weapon in our countdown: the hollow hairpin. This was assassination elevated to an art form so subtle, so perfectly disguised, that victims often helped administer their own deaths. In the imperial court, elaborate hairpins were symbols of status and beauty. Made from precious metals and adorned with jade or pearls, they were worn by noble women as displays of wealth and refinement. But in the hands of a skilled assassin, these ornaments became delivery systems for the most exotic poisons in the Chinese arsenal. The hollow hairpin was crafted with a hidden reservoir and a tiny, sealed opening. This chamber could be filled with liquid toxins, concentrated extracts that would kill with just a few drops. The most favored poison was a distillation of the deadly castor bean, which caused victims to die slowly over several days, their deaths appearing to be from natural illness. Here's what made this weapon so brutally effective: the intimacy of its deployment. The assassin wasn't a shadowy figure striking from darkness. She was a trusted concubine, a beloved wife, a favored servant. She would lean close to her victim, perhaps to whisper sweet words or share a secret. And in that moment of tenderness, she would unseal the hairpin and allow a single drop of poison to fall into their wine, their food, or even onto their skin. The psychological devastation was complete. Victims died knowing they had been betrayed by someone they loved, someone they trusted completely. The hairpin turned intimacy itself into a weapon, making every gesture of affection suspect, every moment of closeness potentially lethal. At number 5, we encounter a weapon that brought the fury of the elements themselves into the assassin's arsenal: the wind and fire wheel. This wasn't just a tool of death. It was a manifestation of Chinese philosophy made lethal, combining the destructive power of wind and fire into a single, terrifying weapon. The wind and fire wheel was a thrown, bladed disc with serrated edges that could be hurled with devastating accuracy. But the true genius lay in its advanced versions: pairs of wheels connected by nearly invisible wire. When thrown in sequence, they created a deadly trap that could decapitate pursuing enemies or slice through multiple targets in a single throw. Picture this scenario. You're a corrupt official fleeing through a narrow alley, your guards running behind you. Suddenly, the lead guard's head simply disappears. Then the second guard falls, his torso separated from his legs. You turn to see what's happening, and there's nothing. Just empty air and the whisper of wind. The wire connecting the two wheels is so thin it's invisible in the darkness, but it's slicing through your men like they're made of paper. The weapon's name wasn't poetic license. It literally harnessed wind and fire. The spinning motion created its own aerodynamics, allowing skilled throwers to achieve impossible trajectories. Some versions were designed to ignite upon impact, the friction of the serrated edges creating sparks that could set clothing or buildings ablaze. But perhaps most terrifying was the weapon's silence. Unlike arrows or crossbow bolts, the wind and fire wheel made almost no sound in flight. Death came as quietly as a breeze, as suddenly as lightning, leaving witnesses unable to explain what they had seen. Number 4 brings us to a weapon that turned capture into something worse than death: the man-catcher. While most assassination weapons were designed for quick, clean kills, the man-catcher was built for a more sinister purpose: taking victims alive for interrogation, torture, or public execution. The man-catcher was a collapsible pole weapon with a spring-loaded, two-pronged head designed to snare victims by the neck. But this wasn't a crude restraint device. It was a precision instrument of terror, engineered to immobilize without killing, to capture without mercy. Here's how the nightmare unfolded. You're walking through what you think is a safe area, perhaps surrounded by your own guards. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the shadows with what appears to be a simple staff. Before you can react, the staff extends to twice its length, and the pronged head snaps around your throat like a mechanical serpent. You're pinned against a wall, unable to move, unable to call for help, as your captor decides your fate. The psychological terror was immense. Unlike other weapons that promised quick death, the man-catcher promised something far worse: helplessness. Victims knew they were about to be dragged away to face interrogation, torture, or public humiliation. The weapon turned proud officials and mighty warriors into struggling, panicked animals, their dignity stripped away in an instant. Imperial guards used smaller versions to discreetly remove troublemakers from crowds, but assassins employed the full-sized version for kidnapping high-value targets. the sight of someone being dragged away by an invisible force, the pole often being too long to see clearly in darkness, created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that was almost as valuable as the capture itself. At number 3, we enter the realm of weapons that killed not just the body, but the soul. Blades coated with heartbreak toxin. This wasn't simply about poisoned weapons. This was about psychological warfare elevated to an art form that would make modern interrogators weep with envy. The heartbreak toxin, known as duancheng san, was a mixture of the most agonizing poisons known to Chinese alchemists. Extracts from the deadly monkshood plant were combined with compounds from the poisonous jequirity bean and other exotic toxins to create a substance that didn't just kill, it tortured. But here's what made this weapon truly diabolical. The poison was designed to work slowly, causing maximum psychological damage before death. A victim struck by a heartbreak toxin blade would feel fine for the first few minutes, perhaps even hours. They might think they had escaped death, that the wound was minor, that they would survive. Then the agony would begin. The toxin attacked the nervous system in waves, causing excruciating pain that came and went unpredictably. Victims would experience moments of relief, followed by renewed torture, their minds breaking under the psychological strain of never knowing when the next wave of agony would strike. The poison earned its name because witnesses said victims literally died of broken hearts, not from the toxin itself, but from the despair of knowing their suffering would never end. Assassins would often strike their targets in public, inflicting what appeared to be minor wounds before melting back into the crowd. Hours later, when the victim began screaming in agony, the assassin would be long gone, leaving behind only terror and the knowledge that death could come disguised as a simple scratch. The weapon turned every minor injury into a source of paranoia, every small cut into a potential death sentence. At number 2, we encounter a weapon that attacked the very senses themselves: the dust of the blind god. This wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was engineered to destroy a person's ability to perceive reality, turning skilled warriors into helpless, screaming victims in seconds. The dust of the blind god was contained in hollow eggshells or small pouches, filled with a diabolical mixture of ground brick dust, lime powder, crushed pepper, and sometimes powdered glass. When thrown into a victim's face, it created a chemical assault on every sense simultaneously. But here's what made this weapon so psychologically devastating. It didn't just cause pain. It caused complete sensory deprivation. The lime would burn the eyes, causing temporary or permanent blindness. The pepper would inflame the nasal passages and throat, making breathing agonizing. The brick dust would coat the mouth and tongue, making speech impossible. The powdered glass would create thousands of microscopic cuts that would sting and burn for hours. Imagine being a skilled swordsman, confident in your abilities, when suddenly your world explodes into pain and darkness. You can't see your attacker. You can't breathe without agony. You can't call for help. You're reduced from a proud warrior to a helpless, choking, blind victim in the space of a heartbeat. The weapon was particularly favored by assassins who needed to escape rather than kill. A handful of dust thrown in the right moment could incapacitate an entire group of guards, allowing the assassin to vanish while their victims writhed in agony. But the psychological impact lasted far longer than the physical effects. Survivors lived in constant fear of that moment when their senses might be ripped away again, when they might be reduced to helpless animals clawing at their burning eyes. The dust of the blind god turned the human body's own sensory systems into instruments of torture, proving that sometimes the cruelest weapons are those that leave their victims alive to remember their helplessness. And now, the moment you've been waiting for. the #1 most brutal weapon in the Chinese assassin's arsenal. But this isn't a blade or poison or even a physical object you can hold. This is something far more terrifying, far more psychologically devastating than anything we've discussed so far. The deaf-mute tribute was the ultimate expression of Chinese assassination philosophy. The perfect murder that left no evidence, no witnesses, and no way for the victim to even understand how they were being killed. Here's how this diabolical system worked. Assassins would send gifts to their targets, beautiful objects that appeared to be tokens of respect or friendship. A letter written on exquisite paper, a book bound in fine leather, a piece of clothing made from the finest silk. These weren't just gifts. They were delivery systems for death itself. The objects were treated with contact poisons so subtle, so carefully applied, that they were completely undetectable. The victim would receive their gift, handle it with pleasure, perhaps show it to friends and family. They would go to bed that night, feeling honored, appreciated, loved, and they would never wake up. But here's what made this weapon so brutally perfect. It turned the victim's own habits against them. The assassin would study their target for months, learning their routines, their preferences, their weaknesses. Did they read every night before bed? Send them a poisoned book. Did they write letters to their family? Send them poisoned paper and ink? Did they have a favorite type of clothing? Send them a poisoned robe. The poison was absorbed through the skin slowly, over hours or even days. The victim would sicken gradually, their death appearing to be from natural causes. No wounds, no violence, no evidence of foul play. Just a person who received a beautiful gift and happened to die of mysterious illness shortly afterward. The psychological warfare was complete and total. The deaf-mute tribute turned every act of kindness into a potential death sentence. It made victims paranoid about gifts, suspicious of friendship, afraid of beauty itself. It poisoned not just bodies, but the very concept of human generosity and trust. This weapon didn't just kill individuals. It killed the social bonds that held communities together. When people began to fear gifts, to suspect every gesture of kindness, society itself began to break down. The assassin achieved something far more devastating than simple murder. They achieved the destruction of trust itself. These 10 weapons represent more than just tools of death. They are windows into a world where killing was elevated to an art form, where psychology and engineering combined to create instruments of terror that could destroy not just bodies, but minds and souls. The Chinese assassins who wielded these weapons weren't simple killers. They were artists of death, engineers of fear, psychologists who understood that the most devastating wounds are often invisible. They created weapons that turned beauty into terror, trust into paranoia, and everyday objects into harbingers of doom. When we look at these brutal instruments today, we're not just studying ancient weapons. We're examining the darkest capabilities of human ingenuity, the terrifying creativity that emerges when brilliant minds are turned toward destruction. These assassins proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the sharpest blade or the deadliest poison. Sometimes it's the ability to turn the victim's own world against them. The shadows of Imperial China may have faded, but the lessons of these weapons remain. In a world where death could come disguised as kindness, where every gift might be a trap, where trust itself became a luxury few could afford, survival required more than strength or skill. It required the ability to see through deception, to question everything, and to understand that the most beautiful rose often hides the sharpest thorns. These weapons didn't just change how people died. They changed how people lived. They created a world where paranoia was wisdom, where suspicion was survival, and where the price of trust could be measured in lives. The legacy of these brutal instruments extends far beyond ancient China. They represent the eternal struggle between those who would use intelligence to protect and those who would use it to destroy. They remind us that human creativity, when turned toward darkness, can produce horrors that haunt civilizations for centuries. But perhaps most chilling of all is this truth. Every one of these weapons was created by someone who understood human nature so completely, so intimately, that they could weaponize our deepest instincts. Our desire for beauty, our need for trust, our longing for connection. They turned our greatest strengths into our most fatal weaknesses. The next time you receive an unexpected gift, the next time someone approaches you with kindness, the next time beauty catches your eye, remember the lessons of the Imperial Chinese assassins. Remember that in their world, death wore 1,000 faces, and the most dangerous enemy was often the one who smiled while they killed you. These weren't just weapons. They were reminders that in the shadows of human civilization, there have always been those who understood that the most effective way to destroy someone isn't to attack their body. It's to attack their ability to trust, to hope, to believe in the goodness of others. The Imperial Chinese assassins are long dead, but their greatest weapon lives on. The knowledge that in a world where anyone might be an enemy, where any object might be a trap, where any gesture of kindness might be the last thing you ever experience, survival isn't just about being strong. It's about being smart enough to stay alive in a world where death has learned to smile. But the brutal ingenuity of Chinese weapons didn't end with assassins. The same civilization that perfected the art of hidden death also created siege weapons so devastating they could level entire cities in hours. Click here to discover how Chinese military engineers built machines of war that made European catapults look like children's toys, and why enemy armies would surrender at the mere sight of these mechanical monsters approaching their walls.